like a small boat on the ocean, sending big waves into motion.
Hello, welcome to Chapter 30, The Crisis of Authority. Here's our roadmap for Chapter 30. Again, it starts domestically in terms of youth culture, the mobilization of minorities, and then feminism and environmentalism, and then we switch back to foreign policy, essentially Kissinger and the world, Nixon and Kissinger and the world, finish up Vietnam, and then we come back home and the politics and the economy under Nixon, and then Nixon's resignation after the Watergate crisis. Okay, we're going to start with youth culture and liberation. And so Brinkley's definition of liberation for the youth back then was just the ability to define and assert yourself. So as opposed to having somebody else define you, that you had the chance to kind of create your own sense of self. And so the new left, they are generally, to think of the new left, you have to think, what was the old left? And so the old left typically was FDR, people of the New Deal, people that operate inside the system. Here, the new left in the 1960s, they tended to be middle class, college educated, white, supporter of the civil rights movement. They tended to follow revolutionaries around the world, although they themselves were not so revolutionary. And one of the groups that exemplified this new left was the Students for a Democratic Society. This group was formed at University of Michigan with Tom Hayden as its founder, one of its founders. They issued one of their famous documents, the Port Huron Statement, which was critical of nuclear weapons and our treatment of the environment and consumerism, but it was more of a general critique as opposed to any specific policy prescriptions. There was an offshoot of SDS, the Weathermen, that tended to be more violent and tended to destroy property and such. Another example of the New Left is the free speech movement at Cal Berkeley. There's some students trying to register people, I think, to protest the war. Cal Berkeley authorities shut it down, and then the protest becomes about having free speech. Okay, and similarly at Cal Berkeley, there's the People's Park movement, and this probably describes the, I think, ridiculousness of the movement at that particular time. There was a vacant lot that Cal Berkeley was going to turn into a parking lot, and the people wanted to preserve that. So it became less about the lot, and I think it was just more kind of anti-authority. Then we switch over to the counterculture. Some of you guys remember the beats of the 1950s kind of evolved into the counterculture. And so the counterculture and the hippies in particular, what typifies the hippies that they flaunt social customs. Okay, so the idea that if you're supposed to grow up, get a job, start a family, have kids, live in the suburbs, that they were going to flaunt that. And so how do you flaunt that? You flaunt that in your hair, so you have the long hair, you have the clothing, you have the customs, including sexual norms that are revolutionized in part because of birth control, but also the sexual inhibitions. And so those were all some of the norms that were thrown off. Haight-Ashbury is just the center of hippie life. It's in San Francisco. Some people, not necessarily Haight-Ashbury, but some of the hippies, they formed rural communes, rejected modern society. And then we get the turn to rock and roll. So rock and roll, if you remember, started with Elvis and rock and roll in the 1950s, and that was scandalous because of the old gyrating of the hips. Rock and roll now is more, music's angry. It's less about just like love songs and love ballads. But now it's anger, frustration, rebelliousness, and that probably has shown no better place than Woodstock. Okay, so what you have, switching gears here, is the mobilization of minorities. So the African American Civil Rights Movement, that actually spills over into the rights movements for other minorities. And so they looked at their own situation and they saw that they were oppressed too, just like African Americans, maybe not to the same degree. So Native American grievances, they start with this idea of that they want the treaties honored, they want change the administration of reservations. Then termination policy. The termination policy was passed in 1953. They're attempting another attempt again to assimilate Native Americans, kind of take away the protection of the reservation, and so they would move away and move into the cities and just kind of blend in with everybody else. And so just to put it in context again, the history of Native American relations with the U.S. government has been kind of back and forth, right? So we have the Dawes Severalty Act back in the late 1800s. Then we get the Indian Reorganization Act with the New Deal, and here, 53, we go back the other way, but that doesn't work. Okay, so what happens is the rise of the Indian Civil Rights Movement. And so in 1968, you have the American Indian Movement, AIM, is on the rise, and they take a more militant aspect, more militant view on things in terms of their actions. And so they, in 1973, they occupy Wounded Knee. If you remember, Wounded Knee was the site of the massacre in 1890. Here in 1973, they take over Wounded Knee to highlight the injustice that happened there and that continues to happen. They actually take over Alcatraz, the prison off the shore of San Francisco, off the coast of San Francisco. And they issue this great sarcastic statement that they're claiming Alcatraz as their own reservation because it has no running water, it's rocky, and you can't really grow any land or grow any crops there, and so therefore it'd be a great reservation. They do win some important legal victories. So the U.S. versus Wheeler gets rid of the Termination Acts. They do get some civil rights in other Supreme Court cases. But the American Indian movement never united all Americans, Native Americans. And so there is this dispute between equal rights and individual rights versus the idea of tribal rights. There's a map. Okay, another group that was activated during the 1960s was Latinos. And so what happens with Latinos is they have a surge in immigration. After World War II, there's a growth in immigration from Mexico as well as Latin America. And they adopt the term Chicano activism. So Chicano activism, the term Chicano is to highlight the similarities they have in language and the same heritage. La Raza, which is the family, is the slogan that they fight under. And what happens is 90% of the immigrants live in the cities. Okay, they're unable to get high wages because limitations in education and language. And so the ones that do go work often go work out in the fields, in agricultural fields. Okay, so Cesar Chavez leads the farm workers. Okay, and so he forms a union, United Farm Workers. They're protesting for higher pay, and again, learning the lessons from the African American Civil Rights Movement. How do you get higher pay? You set a boycott. And what they did first, they got people to boycott grapes, buying grapes. So stop buying grapes and stop buying wine. And then later, when the Nixon administration tries to encourage the export of grapes to England, they also get the union workers over there to reject the grapes. Also, later a lettuce boycott. And those boycotts are successful as they do get a pay raise from the farm owners. Okay, another group that's activated is the gay liberation movement. And so back in the 60s, prior to this, the gays were a harassed group, and so people were in the closet, quote unquote. You didn't admit it. In fact, the DSM probably 3, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that the psychologists use, actually defined homosexuality as a disease. And then what happens in Stonewall Inn is a bar in New York City, down in Greenwich Village. The cops occasionally would go there and they would just harass the patrons, knowing that they're not going to fight back, they're not going to say anything because gays are an oppressed group here in society. And then the Stonewall riot occurs on June 27th, 1969, where the cops are there harassing them, and then people start throwing things, bottles, a crowd gathers, and they're throwing things at the cops. I think they actually try to burn down the Stonewall riot or Stonewall Inn, almost trapping the cops in there. And so this kicks off the gay liberation movement, and I think your generation probably has seen the effects of that. Some more gay people are holding public office. There's gay and lesbian studies programs at universities. A number of laws prohibiting discrimination. One temporary setback: Bill Clinton in the 1990s tried a "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" to allow policy to let gays serve in the military. That was widely criticized and later overturned. So now gays can serve in the military. And probably the capstone to all that, in 2013, U.S. versus Windsor legalizes gay marriage. And so again, that all kind of is kicked off back with the Stonewall riot, 1969. Okay, so the new feminism compared to the old feminism that advocated for suffrage, the rebirth starts with the feminine mystique. Okay, the feminine mystique is a book written by Betty Friedan. Okay, and the feminine mystique is this idea that a woman's ideal life would be to get married, have kids, have a house in the suburbs. And what Betty Friedan did is she was actually interviewing people for a college reunion, and as she interviewed women, she found out that they all kind of suffered from the same malaise, that they're lethargic, didn't have energy, didn't have interest. And every time they would tell somebody, their husbands or their doctor or someone said, "Oh, you probably just overworked. You want to take a break." And what they found out that they weren't. And when Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, women wrote into her saying, "That's exactly how I felt." And I always thought it was just me, but it's nice to hear that other women do it. And one of the great quotes from Betty Friedan is that the feminine mystique is burying millions of women alive. Um, so this is kind of the rebirth of the new feminism. You get the National Organization of Women founded now. And originally now is concerned about workplace discrimination, so unequal pay, unequal opportunities in the workplace, um, educational opportunities, disparities there. And then later, now, now and later, that's funny. Um, Later, the new directions in the women's rights movement, they shifted. And so um, they shifted to an assault on the male power structure and then fighting exploitation. So it's not about personal fulfillment, but it is about fighting the male power structure as they see it. And so 90% of women, college women, let's see, 90% of women who have college degrees are working. So there's just more of them working. I think there's a third of women in 1963 that are working in the workplace. What happens with this new direction is that women are starting to postpone marriage, starting to get married later, have children later, but they're fighting things like language. And so they said the sexism is really inherent in the language. You think about the difference in calling boys and for instance, boys when they reach a certain age, like 16, 18, they become men. You don't refer to them as boys. But females, when they're 16 or 18, you still call them girls. When they're adult women, you still call them girls. And they would argue that's inherently sexist. Even in Mr. and Mrs. So you know that a woman that is married typically was called Mrs. A man that you would call Mr., you wouldn't know whether he's married or not, and there's no equivalent for females. Um, Other things, just the idea of adopting a husband's name, that you have to, that you kind of lost your identity as a female when you got married. So you became Mrs. John Smith. You became the mother of, Johnny and Susie. That you had no kind of independence on your own. Okay. So what women do is they push for, well, actually, they push for an equal rights amendment, which we will talk about next. Okay, women in paid workforce. Here's a chart for you. Okay, so the political and economic success of women. Women do gain a lot of success. They actually pass, or they push for the passage of an equal rights amendment that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. And so that is approved in 1972. They need 38 states to approve it. They get to 35 and they kind of stall, and they get some more time, but they come up short. And one of the things that happens with the Equal Rights Amendment is that there's actually a woman that leads the charge against it, Phyllis Schlafly. Um, and Phyllis Schlafly's argument was that if you pass the Equal Rights Amendment, women wouldn't have a special place in society anymore. So there'd be no more Mother's Day. There would be no more female bathrooms. There would just be bathrooms, and we'd all have to use the same bathrooms. Women would have to fight in combat, which is ironic because part of the ongoing feminist movement is that women wanted to be equal in the military, and now they can fight in combat. Okay, and if you guys haven't heard, part of the debate now is whether they should be subject to the draft like men are. So the ERA does go down. They do have political and economic success. Actually, we get our first Supreme Court justice, female Supreme Court justice in 1980, and then Bill Clinton appoints another one during his tenure, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then President Obama appoints two more. So Women do make progress. If any of you guys are familiar with like the Me Too movement, we can argue in class whether that is progress or not. Okay, related to the new feminism is the ability to control your own body, as they would argue. So the abortion controversy, Roe versus Wade is the Supreme Court case that legalized abortion, 1973. Okay, and so Roe was a woman that lived in Texas. Texas did not have legal abortion, and so she had to drive up to Oklahoma to get it, putting an undue burden on her. The Supreme Court agreed, and the Supreme Court legalized abortion in the first trimester, so for the first 3 months. And they based the argument, or their rationale for legalizing abortion was the Fourth Amendment, that you have a right to privacy, and the 14th Amendment, that the rights of a citizen. And so that is obviously a hot topic still today in terms of whether abortion should be legal, should be scaled back, should it be extended in terms of the time period, and also can you put restrictions on abortion in terms of parental notification, spousal notification, mandatory waiting periods, um, things such as that. So still a hot topic today, and I'm sure you will hear about it again in your lifetime. Okay, transitioning away from the groups into environmentalism. And so Brinkley talks about the new science of ecology. And so ecology is not conservation. So when you think about Teddy Roosevelt and the conservation movement, that was more about aesthetics, so that the natural world is beautiful. Think Hetch Hetchy, and that we didn't want to spoil the view, and that was the impetus for preserving the environment. But now ecology is, it's not the individual landscapes, but the interaction of the natural world. So how do the plants and the insects and the birds and other animals all interact? And so this becomes a point of growth after the war. We have a number of new professional environmental activists, not just the typical ones, so the Sierra Club, I think the World Wildlife Foundation, but also other groups that join in as well. Okay, and part of this is kicked off, we mentioned this before in the last unit, Rachel Carson, the Silent Spring. And so if you remember the last unit, they had the picture of the kids walking through the pesticide cloud as a way to deal with the insects. And that was supposedly an advance in society, right? So science has led us to bigger and better things. We don't have to be bothered by the insects. But what they found is DDT killed the insects, but also killed the birds, and it made its way through the food chain. So polluted the water, polluted the food chain, and the birds were dying off. Hence the term, or hence the book title, The Silent Spring. But on top of that, we have a lot of water and air pollution during the 1960s and 70s. Water and air pollution, so in particular the water pollution, one of the worst examples of this was the Cuyahoga River. Brinkley talks about in Ohio. In the 1950s, it catches fire, and so what happens? There's somebody that's on a boat that throws a lit cigarette over overboard in the water, and because there's so much pollution and chemicals in the water, it actually catches fire. The air pollution, there's a lot of smog, there's a lot of car exhaust at this time, pollution from factories, and so here's the crazy part. At this point in the 1960s and 70s. The environment is not controversial. So this is not a political divide between like left and right. People just agree that the water's dirty and the air is dirty, and we should do something about it. So what you get, the first Earth Day happens in 1970. Again, massively popular. They purposely try to not make it political, okay, so that people wouldn't oppose it. So it's just, hey, the Earth Day, who could be against the Earth? First Earth Day in 1970. In 1970, you have the Environmental Protection Agency established by Richard Nixon. Okay, and again, so just to speak to how unpolitical, non-political this is. I don't think unpolitical is a word. Non-political. Richard Nixon's a Republican. He's actually for smaller government. We'll find out later in the chapter. But here he creates the EPA. He actually passes the Clean Air Act in 1970. 1972 passes the Clean Water Act. Again, so Republican president passing EPA, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, which probably would be impossible today because of the political divide. Okay, switching over to foreign policy. We're still fighting the Vietnam War, and so Richard Nixon is now president. He appoints Henry Kissinger, a Harvard professor, really smart, really well spoken, really good at politics, as the Secretary of State. And his solution for Vietnam is let's turn it over to the South Vietnamese. So it shouldn't be, again, at one point we have a high of over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. And so we're doing the fighting. He has this idea like, why don't we turn over the fighting to the South Vietnamese? So the Vietnamization is the policy of gradually pulling out and turning the fighting over to South Vietnam. If that sounds familiar, we did the same thing with the Iraq War just recently and trying to do the same thing in Afghanistan today. So what you have is they are trying to find some way out, but unfortunately we get an escalation. What happens is that they being North Vietnamese are moving troops and supplies into the south through Cambodia, okay, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And Nixon authorizes the bombing of Cambodia without telling Congress, without getting authorization from Congress. And actually, we support the overthrow of the Cambodian government. Okay, so there is a ruler in place that quickly gives assent to America to continue bombing the trails and actually incursions to Cambodia. You might think, well, what's the big deal? Because the war is not with Cambodia. We're fighting in South Vietnam, maybe against North Vietnam. Cambodia is not a part of the war. Okay, and so that's why that's startling. That escalates the protests. Kent State, there's a protest. There's 4 students killed at Kent State, 2 of which aren't even protesting the war. They just happen to be walking by, shot by the National Guard. In addition to that, you have the My Lai massacre, which is revealed in the Pentagon Papers. So My Lai actually happened in 1971. And what happens is there's an American commander that loses his mind. Brian Calley is his last name. Can't remember if it's Brian or not. Anyways, he massacres an entire village. So men, women, children, elderly, all killed. And the only way he's actually stopped is there's an American helicopter gunner that points the gun at him and tells him to stop or he's going to shoot them all. And so actually the prosecution of Calley becomes a hot point issue at home too. We get the Easter bombing, so as a way to try to convince South Vietnam the North Vietnam and the communists to give up, is that we increase the bombing, which of course means that more people are killed, and that brings about more protests. So we are trying to find a way out, peace with honor, and Nixon's strategy is, why don't we increase the bombing? Okay, and again, at this point, we have dropped more bombs. We will drop more bombs on Vietnam than we do all of World War II in terms of tonnage. So we increase the bombing while we're trying to negotiate. And unfortunately, during this time, we have 15 bombers lost during this increased bombing, and compared to the 1 bomber that we had lost the entire time before this. So we do come up with an agreement, and there's a sticking point because we're trying to get out. South Vietnam doesn't want us to get out or wants us to leave troops there because they're probably going to be in trouble, which they are. So we decide to leave. Rather quickly, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, falls. While it's falling, they ask President Ford, who's now president, and they ask him for help, and he asks Congress, and Congress says no. Okay, in the meantime, Cambodia suffers another revolution. This time it's Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, communists, but kind of crazy communists, which we'll see over a third of Cambodians die during their murderous rule. Okay, so Nixon, Kissinger, and the world. Nixon talks about a multipolar world. Okay, and so how do you keep the world balanced? It's more than just U.S. and Soviet Union. You have multiple powers such as China, and so actually China and Soviet Union are vying for control of the communist world at this time. And Nixon had set up some secret visits. Kissinger actually set up secret visits to China. We support the kicking Taiwan out of the UN and China getting the UN seat. Nixon visits China, recognizes China, and opens up trade relations with China. Okay. Which of course then makes the Soviet Union a little bit jealous, so now they're a little bit quicker to negotiate. And so we negotiate a nuclear arms treaty, SALT I. Okay, SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This freezes the production of ICBMs, so the long-range missiles that we have pointed at each other. The problems of multipolarity, though, the Nixon Doctrine, nobody really remembers the Nixon Doctrine, so don't stress yourself too much over this one. But the Nixon Doctrine is says we're going to develop allies, but we're going to leave them alone. Okay, so we'll make friends, but we're not necessarily going to support or give money or send troops and things like that. Okay, and so where does this show up? It shows up in Israel. Israel, there's a 6-day war in 1967 where they captured the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza Strip. There's another war, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where we actually have to convince them not to go further. And remember, many of you asking like, well, why is recognition of Israel a big deal? Because again, Israel's our ally in the Mideast here. And so we support Israel, we sell Israel weapons, and the other Arab countries surrounding Israel aren't too keen on that. And so to teach the United States a lesson, they have a brief oil embargo, which hurts us economically. Okay, and it's kind of like the first ding against us. Okay, in typical Brinkley fashion, he bounces back to domestic policies. And so Nixon, as president, he's going to try to dismantle the Great Society. He wants to end forced busing. He abolishes the Office of Economic Opportunity. Let's see, if it was up to him, he would get rid of other social welfare programs. However, in getting rid of those, he does offer, which is remarkably radical at that time and even today, a guaranteed income. So we don't need to have welfare if we have a guaranteed income for every individual. Okay, so switching from the Warren Court, which was a notoriously liberal court, to the Nixon Court, you have a number of important Supreme Court cases, a few which are listed here and others that I'm going to talk about. Baker versus Carr says they have to give equal weight to when it comes to setting voting districts, which then has the power of shifting more legislative power to the urban areas, and then by urban you should read the African American Hispanics that are living in the urban areas. A big one is Bakke versus the Board of Regents of California. So Bakke was a white student that applied to the University of California medical schools, and he was denied because at that time the University of California had quota system that they reserved, I believe, was 10 spots for minority candidates. And Bakke said that's unconstitutional. He has better scores, test scores, better GPA. And when the Supreme Court heard it, they kind of split the difference. They said affirmative action is legal. You can consider race. However, you can't put a specific number to race, something like holding 10 spots open. And so that's kind of where we've been at with affirmative action. If any of you guys have followed along, you know, Harvard's being sued by Asian Americans, saying that they discriminate against Asian Americans. University of Michigan actually had a landmark case in the early 2000s, again, with their law school and LSA. So those are a couple important cases. Another important case is Miranda versus Arizona. This is the one that established the Miranda rights. So when you get arrested, the police have to read you your Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. If you can't afford an attorney, blah, blah, blah. I think you guys have watched enough movies to see that. Also, Gideon versus Wainwright. Gideon versus Wainwright establishes the right to a lawyer, no matter how small the crime. So Clarence Earl Gideon was accused of breaking into a bar in Florida. They said because it's a small charge, it's not a murder charge, you're not entitled to a lawyer. He was sent to jail, and he appealed from jail, and he actually won his appeal. One of the other important cases is Engel versus Vitale. Engel versus Vitale bans prayer in schools. Okay, so winding down here, the election is 72. 72 is coming up. George McGovern's a super liberal from South Dakota. Nixon actually encourages George Wallace to run again, you know, thinking that would hurt the Democrats, and Wallace is about to, but then there's an assassination attempt on his life and he's paralyzed. Nixon wins a landslide re-election. Okay, and that's important. That'll come up in a sec. So back to the economy, the cost of the war in Great Society drives up inflation. Okay, so inflation is growing. Adding to that problem, the oil-producing states, most countries in the Middle East, or most of them which are in the Middle East, have this cartel or OPEC. And OPEC, what they do is they purposely limit the production of barrels of oil so they can drive up the price. And drive up the price, they do a 400% increase in the price of oil. Okay, and what that it's a big psychological blow, because here we are, the most powerful nation in the world, albeit except for Vietnam, the most powerful nation in the world. We are brought to our knees by OPEC, by what we see as third world countries, developing nations, because they control, and we become so dependent on energy that they are able to kind of bring down our economy to a certain degree. Lastly, in the beginning of the shifts in the 1970s, and unfortunately we don't realize it probably for another 20 or 30 years, is the beginning of the shift of deindustrialization. Okay, and so the plants in the U.S. at this point are 20, 30 years old, getting old. They are less efficient than the newer plants in Europe and in Japan. But more importantly, there's a movement of manufacturing jobs out of the United States. Okay, so manufacturing gradually decreased. It was at its high point, I think, 35% of the economy. Currently, today, it is about, I want to say 12 or 13%. And that starts in the 1970s. And with those industrial jobs leaving, that's also goodbye to the middle class. And so a lot of the middle class is built off of those industrial jobs, those factory jobs. Okay, and we get a shift to the third wave. I think I drew this up for you guys at some point early in the year. First wave is agricultural era. Second wave is industrial era. Third wave is like a knowledge era. So I think Google, Facebook, Amazon. Obviously, those things aren't around yet, but this is the beginning of the shift. Okay, so there's inequality, and so the spread in income distribution begins to spread. And so it used to look like a double diamond. And so we would have a upper class, we'd have a big middle class, and then we'd have our lower class. And that used to be income distribution in this country. And now, and I think I've drawn this for you at some point too, income distribution looks more like the Eiffel Tower. And so you have the top 10% here. You have probably the 0.1% or 1%, which is far and away richer than the that person at the 10%. But even the 0.1% is far richer than even those people at 1%. And then there's a lot of poor people. So the inequality that we see today starts to take off during really after 1973. Nixon's response to this, because what happens with the economy is this weird phenomenon called stagflation. So normally where you have inflation, you have low unemployment, and vice versa. Here in the 1970s, we have a weird combination. We have high inflation and also high unemployment, which really shouldn't make sense. Okay, and so Nixon's response to stagflation was the 90-day price and wage freeze. Because part of inflation is, again, psychological. If you think prices are going to go up, you're going to buy stuff now, so you get the lower price as opposed to a future high price. A 90-day price and wage freeze, and that doesn't really work because as soon as the 90 days are up, inflation goes back up, and that doesn't work. So Brinkley kind of leaves us hanging there with inflation. Lastly, then you have the presidential scandals. And so the changing presidency, Nixon in particular, I mean, he wasn't the first one, but certainly he helped accelerate. It's an imperial presidency. And so what that means is he consolidates power. And so we're supposed, you guys learned in elementary school, we're supposed to have checks and balances and all three branches are co-equal. Nixon gradually consolidates power, making the presidency more powerful. And he's kind of a paranoid guy, insecure. And even though he won the 72 election in a landslide, he really was insecure about his own victory. And so one of the things he did was he had people doing dirty tricks for him. And so one of those dirty tricks was the Watergate break-in. The Watergate is a hotel office complex in Washington, D.C. And that's where the Democratic National Headquarters was housed at. And so there's a break-in there. And they get caught. The people get caught. But what's weird about the burglars is that they are dressed in suits and they have hundreds of dollars in their pocket. And so, initially it just looks like regular old burglary. One of the burglars writes the judge a note, says this is much more than that. And so it's the beginning of the investigation of Nixon. And his big problem, and it's always the problem of everyone. It's always the cover-up. Okay, so he claims he knows nothing about it. It's this low-level burglary. He's the president. What's he have to do with that? And as they gradually trace the money, okay, and there's a couple of Washington Post reporters that do a great job of following up on this. As they trace the money, it comes closer and closer to the president. And what they find out is that actually he has secret tape. This is how paranoid he is. Well, how paranoid he is and how great of a president he thought he was going to be. There is a secret tape recording device in the White House desk that's voice activated. And so when they find that out, they want the tapes, and Nixon refuses to hand over the tapes. And so what happened? There's a special prosecutor, not unlike Mueller, what we have today, kind of the same role, that's appointed by Nixon. And Jaworski, the name Jaworski, wants the tapes. Leon Jaworski wants the tapes. Nixon refuses, and he fires Leon Jaworski. Okay. And so in protest of Leon Jaworski being fired, the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General quit as well. That's why it's called the Saturday Night Massacre. So Nixon is essentially forced to appoint another special prosecutor who still wants the tapes. And what they find out, so they're demanding the tapes. Nixon refused to turn over the tapes. This goes to the Supreme Court. So the U.S. versus Richard Nixon. Does Richard Nixon have to turn over the tapes? And the Supreme Court rules against Richard Nixon that no man is above the law. And that's an important principle. No man is above the law. And that if you have evidence in an active investigation, you have to turn those over. And Nixon turns over the tapes, and what they find out, and there's no so much as a smoking gun, but they do find out from the tapes that he was part of a cover-up. And the question is, what did he know and when did he know it? And so he's going to be charged with the obstruction of justice, that he tried to cover up the burglary. He is charged with he tries to talk the CIA. He tries to get the CIA to talk the FBI and to stop investigating this crime. And he's also in defiance of Congress. And so the walls are closing in. Even Republicans are abandoning Nixon. He's probably going to get impeached. Before he gets impeached, though, he resigns. And kind of weird part, before Nixon resigning, actually, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned as well. And this was a couple years earlier. So Spiro Agnew resigned because when they found out when he was governor of Maryland that he had this kickback scheme that he's still running when he was vice president, taking bribes essentially and getting money back from awarding contracts. And so he was charged with tax evasion. He has to resign. Gerald Ford, who played football at the University of Michigan, has his presidential library in Grand Rapids, serving a House member. He becomes the new vice president. Again, and so for all you trivia fans, he's the only unelected president. Okay, so the people didn't actually vote on Gerald Ford. So Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford becomes president, and the long national nightmare is finally over. Kind of, but not really. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Sorry, a little bit longer today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and to buy the merch. See ya.